you can take a nap, okay? So, I'm not going to be offended, and I'm a professor. I'm used to people napping when I'm talking, right? I want to talk about Christian nationalism, but I also want to talk about stories. I want to talk about my story a little bit, but I want to talk about the story of a lot of us in the room, and I'm going to get to that in a second. Before I get there, it strikes me that we've heard a lot about Christian nationalism over the last couple of days. We've heard about it as it relates to school boards this morning, as it relates to the Supreme Court, as it relates to the attempted takeover, and conquer state legislatures and so on. So let's talk for a minute about what that is, and then let's talk about how it leads to a sense of apocalypse that itself leads to a sense of extremism, okay? So Christian nationalism has three foundational components in my mind: the myth of the Christian nation, nostalgia for past glory, and an apocalyptic view of the nation's future. Now, this is part of my story, because I converted at age 14 and became a minister at age 20. And I believe that God and country went hand in hand. I was playing a role in a story that went beyond me. It was a Christian nationalist story. It was a narrative about a lost past, a promised future, and the stakes of the present. I wanted to live out my part in that story with virtue, with dedication, and I took it really seriously. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute, and I'm going to close today coming back to the sense of story and narrative. But before we do that, let's figure out what Christian nationalism actually is. Christian nationalists think that this country was built for and by Christian people. They want a public square that is privileged. Andrew Seidel said yesterday, we're not coming for your rights, we're coming for your privilege. And that is exactly what they want to keep. They see themselves as central to the narrative of the United States. Not only as a nation under God, but one elected by God. The Christian elements of Christian nationalism are sometimes hard to parse, but they believe in God's rule and election, and that's fused with a white Christian ideology. The idea that the United States is superior to all other nations, that we should take an America-first approach to policy and trade, and in many cases, that white people deserve to remain at the top of social, political, and economic hierarchies. Christian nationalists also believe that the United States is a Christian nation in some way. And this may be surprising, and it comes back to this idea of story. A lot of them don't attend church. A lot of them don't read those Bibles that we just talked about. And a lot of them don't pray. Because what they're living out is a story about who they are and the country they think they inhabit. So whether or not they actually go to church on Easter Sunday or attend Bible study or get up early to pray before work, it may not matter as much as we think. What matters is the story they've been told about that past and that future, and how they can change the present as a result. What happens is the character that they think they're living out in the United States. Now, Christian nationalists, as I said, they share this conviction, this nostalgia for past glory. They think that the city on a hill that America is has been invaded, that the city on a hill needs a wall around it in order to protect people. They think that, similar to Israel in the Hebrew Bible, that if the nation disobeys God's commandments, that it should expect divine retribution and ruin. But it's never them who are the disobedient ones. It's all those others. The immigrants, non-white folks, the non-Christian folks, and dare I say, lo and behold, the atheists. And they, in their minds, have the keys. They have the keys to getting us back on track. They have the keys to getting us to where we should be. Now, this is what Jerry Falwell said, and I know I was going to play the video, but I didn't want to traumatize all of you.
Thank you.
I took it out, all right? This is what he said a couple days after 9/11. Throwing God successfully with the help of the federal court system, throwing God out of the public square, out of the schools, the abortionists have got to bear some burden for this, because God will not be mocked. And when we destroy 40 million little innocent babies, we make God mad. The pagans, and the abortionists, and the feminists, and the gays, and the lesbians who are actively trying to make an alternative lifestyle, the ACLU, People for the American Way, all of them, if you had heard of the American Atheists, I think they'd be in there, okay? Who have tried to secularize America, I point the finger in their face and say, you helped this happen. This was days after 9/11. So when I tell you that they think of this country as being punished for the sin disobeying God. And when I tell you that they're blaming all those others, those not real Americans, well, here's a pretty good example. Now, the final trait of Christian nationalism is its apocalyptic tone. The evangelical emphasis on the end of the world, the idea that Jesus could return at any moment and take everybody to heaven and all that business, is transposed into a crisis narrative about the United States. It's the idea that we're on the precipice of a catastrophic decline. If real Americans don't take decisive action, their story goes. They will not simply lose their majority in the houses of Congress or see a political opponent in the White House. The country, as they know it, will be gone forever. And I want to just spend a minute on this bit. The idea that we're in an apocalypse. Because when you're in an emergency, you do things you wouldn't normally do. You take actions you wouldn't normally take. I have a little 18-month-old daughter at home. And I can tell you, there's a lot of days when I say, hey, we're going to get out of the house, me and you, we're going to go do this thing. Let's go to the playground, maybe to Target, I don't know, it's going to be pretty exciting, okay? It's going to get pretty wild. And it usually takes me 47 minutes to get that child out of the house. We got to get shoes and socks, we got to get extra diapers, an extra pair of clothes. We have to make sure we have water and the diaper bag, and then usually what I forget is that Dad also needs shoes and socks and pants and all that kind of stuff. All right. But I'll tell you what, I live in California, when there's an earthquake, I don't do any of that. You know what I do? I just grab that little baby and I get out of the house. Yeah. You know why? Because when you're in extreme danger, when you think the apocalypse is happening, you can justify extreme action. You don't think about planning ahead. You don't think about long-term effects. What you think about is right now. And so when white Christian nationalists and Christian nationalists in general tell you that this country is on the precipice of an apocalypse, they're justifying their extreme actions. They're telling you why they are allowed to take the kinds of actions when it comes to lawsuits and gaslighting and bad faith engagement that we heard all about this morning on school boards. They're telling you why. They don't need to consider you a political opponent. They're telling you why you're a political enemy. And there's a difference. There's a difference in losing an election to an opponent and thinking that the person on the other side is an enemy of your state, smells like sulfur, has demon DNA, hates children, maybe eats some of them sometimes, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, breakfast, whatever it may be, okay? Imminent apocalypse means extremism is justified, and it also means this. If you don't have the demographics or the people, your best bet is to do away with the democracy to save the nation. It's an emergency after all. We got to get out of the house, or we got to save the house, or something. So, if we don't have the votes, that's not going to stop us. For white Christian nationalists, we have to do something, and oftentimes, especially in the last decade, the answer has been authoritarianism. Leaving democracy behind might be for them the way to save the nation. One voice, one person is not a sacred value in this culture. The sacred value is power. And so if authoritarianism is the answer to the democracy problem, that's where they'll go. This is Alan Carlson, the former director of the Family and American Studies Center and the founder and longtime international secretary of the World Congress of Families. There are great experiments in post-liberal political and economic life occurring right now in real places in Poland's Law and Justice Party, in the Hungary of Prime Minister Viktor Orban, and yes, in the land of the great Russians led by Vladimir Putin. Increasingly over the last 2 decades, Christian nationalists, and especially and most particularly white Christian nationalists, have been looking to these leaders, Orban, Putin, and so on, as the exemplars of the kind of Christian leaders they want in the United States. They see them as the kind of leaders who will take action regardless of having the votes, without having to wait for Congress or Parliament to act, and not waiting on even the Supreme Court, which may or may not be stacked to the hilt.
So also, Russia is a Christian nationalist nation, actually Orthodox Christian and Russian Orthodox. So, I actually support Putin's right to protect his people and always put his people first, but also protect their Christian values. I identify more with with Putin's Christian values than I do with Joe Biden. So, there is that, that there is that there. And, Christian nationalist countries also are a threat to the global regime, like the Luciferian regime that wants to mash everything together. But Putin takes care of his people. He looks out for his people. I watched as he deported, like they literally walked them through the streets, the criminal illegals who were coming into their country. They walked them out and they escorted them out and they said, get out. I can respect that. I can respect that, and I can respect the fact that Putin does everything he can to protect his people.
So that's Lauren Witzka. That's Lauren Witzka. She was the 2020 candidate for Senate in Delaware. Did not win. However, you can see there what I'm talking about.
Yep.
I identify more with Putin than with Biden. Now, we're not going to get into Biden today, okay? So usually I'd say, ask me after class. I'm just going to say, don't ask me, okay? But I identify more with the leader of Russia than I do with the United States. I am a Christian nationalist. I would rather, and unfortunately, because of the profession I chose and the life I live, it's very glamorous. I spent a lot more time reading and watching videos of Lauren Witzka than I'd like to admit. And she says in those videos and in interviews that she actually wishes that Putin would invade the United States to save us.
Yep.
Now, it's easy to dismiss someone like her as a French figure, but this is who was put up for Senate in Delaware just a couple of years ago. I mean, that's a big deal. Not state, right? Okay, but Senate. White Christian nationalists see, like Lauren Witzka, see autocratic regimes as the shining cities on the hill. They are the paragons of how to construct a pure society. Using the rhetoric of Christian heritage and family values, leaders like Orban and Putin give transcendent authority to their anti-democratic, anti-LGBTQ, and anti-pluralist models of governance. If you follow Putin, for example, he increasingly uses the language of holy war. He talks about the spiritual values of Russia, Russia's Christian heritage, and the need to defend the nuclear family as the foundation of society. Putin learned that language from American Christian nationalists in the 90s and the early aughts. And in turn, those Christian nationalists are learning from him the tactics of authoritarian governance and leadership. There's a global network of learning and teaching that's happening. Now, we can bring this home down to the ground. We don't have to just talk about Senate candidates or Vladimir Putin. My friend Sarah Riccardi Swartz is an anthropologist, and she does field work amongst various Christian groups across the country. One of those was in Appalachia with a group of Russian Orthodox converts. And you might say, well, why are we talking about Orthodox converts? Well, because many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, whether it's your run-ins on a local level at the school board or in your county races, evangelical Christians, Pentecostals, and so on. What's going on with all the conversions to Orthodoxy? Well, a lot of those folks, evangelicals and so on, have found evangelicalism insufficiently authoritarian and insufficiently, thank you for laughing, that's okay, insufficiently patriarchal, insufficiently exclusionary for their liking.
Yep.
So they have converted to Orthodoxy. So in this case, Sarah, my friend, is interviewing a young woman who considers herself to be a trad wife living in the mountains of West Virginia. And she says, in terms of politics, how would you describe yourself? That's what Sarah asks. And then Gwen responds, a young woman living in the Appalachian Mountains, I'm a fascist. I'm trad. Gwen was one of the very few cradle-born Orthodox Christians living in a community of over 100 American converts to Russian Orthodoxy. If you read Sarah's piece on this community, on 4th of July they gather and they celebrate the nation, and they have food and a big feast. And at the end of the piece, it turns out that they're celebrating Mother Russia, not the United States. Now, all of that to say, the admiration for Putin is widespread, and I think some of you have seen that in the response to the invasion of Ukraine. I think it's puzzling to wonder why. Why would so many of the white evangelicals, why so many of the Christian nationalists in my midst, why would they not, why is this an issue? And the answer is simply that they see Putin as the kind of leader we need here. The kind of nationalist, the kind of patriarch, the kind of bully, the kind of barbarian. The Appalachian community, Sarah says, is a small yet globally connected node in a network of right-wing extremism that has been spreading across the United States, Europe, and the global South. In a state and county that went red for Trump in both elections, Orthodox converts were outliers who believed American democracy was too weak to offer them a future free from the tyranny of liberal secularism. So once again, even the MAGA movement is not enough for these folks. Putin and Trump, she says, share political tactics and popular appeal among conservatives. Both play to their religious bases, consistently negate fundamental human rights, and express the soft totalitarianism that generates its power from a cult of personality. For Orthodox converts, however, Putin offered something Trump could not: a vision of the future unfettered from democracy, with true Christianity guiding public life. Now, if you think this is limited, you're thinking, well, all right, we've got this professor up here, and he's talking about a small group in Western Appalachia. I mean, come on. Let me give you another example. 4 or 5 months ago, a book came out called The Case for Christian Nationalism. And once again, Christian nationalism has become a moniker and a label that many are now wearing proudly. It's something they accept, and they want you to know that's who they are. So a man named Stephen Wolfe publishes a book called The Case for Christian Nationalism. It's about 500 pages. Again, choosing this profession, doing what I do, means I had to read the book. Yeah, it was a good time.
Sounds so fun.
It was very fun. Wolfe makes the case in that book that the United States should be a Christian nation, meaning that we should have a Christian prince who rules in a hierarchy of Christian magistrates. He talks in the book and on Twitter about how if you commit blasphemy, meaning you say some words that he doesn't approve of, or the Christian prince perhaps, then you might need to go to jail. Mm-hmm. You're not in church on Sunday, you might need to go to jail. You're an atheist? Any atheists here?
One or two.
You might need to be escorted out of the country, like Lauren Witzka said Putin does to those folks who don't belong in Russia. He thinks interracial marriage might be a sin.
Mm-hmm. Relatively simple.
Mixed race person, that's a thing for me. He thinks that women should submit completely to their husbands, and he says in the introduction of the book, he's writing to white European men because women do not have any authority. Now, again, you're thinking, all right, great, obscure book.
Overturn the 19th
you have to
Amendment.
read it, we don't, come on, leave us alone. When the book came out, it was in the top 100 on Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
So how many books on Amazon? About 10 million? To be in the top 100, you have to be selling a lot of books. Now, it hung around the top 3,000 or 4,000 for months. So the seminarians, the pastors, the preachers, the run-of-the-mill, young Christian nationalists, that's the book they're turning to. Even if Putin and Orban rely on undemocratic processes, physical violence, and various forms of corruption to achieve what they see as the proper order to their societies, white Christian nationalists favor their tactics over the slow-moving processes of a democratic republic. When the bedrock of your worldview is the will to power, all that matters is results. The goal is domination, not dialogue or debate, much less democracy. This is a window into why, as we heard this morning, there is so much bad faith engagement, so much gaslighting, so many just undemocratic tactics taken on local school boards, by mayors in your towns, by the county supervisors who oversee your county. This is the window into their thinking. If you're in an apocalypse, extremism is justified. If you're in an apocalypse, democracy is not the best form of governance. And if you're in an apocalypse, you have to do whatever you need to make decisions and have power. And that is where we are. So, let's get away from these dusty old books, all right? I'll stop complaining about the books I have to read, but I'll start complaining about something else. Let's talk about the Supreme Court. Andrew talked about it yesterday, and we all learned 2 days ago. This was nice to wake up to on Friday morning, right? And Clarence Thomas takes lavish gifts from a mega donor named Harlan Crow.
Yep.
Well, we learned some time ago, but it's all just come back to light, that Harlan Crow, if you go to his house in Dallas, has a whole collection of Nazi paraphernalia.
Yep.
And he has a whole statue garden filled with the most despicable despots from the 20th century, including Lenin, including Tito, including Stalin. Now, if you ask him, he might say, well, I have those so history doesn't repeat itself. I have those because that's the Garden of Evil, I guess. Okay? But if you read further into the story, and if you like, I'll send it to you. Just come up and ask me later. People who visit his house, they note every time that the paintings and the paraphernalia and the statues of the despots and the totalitarians and the fascists are hanging next to artwork by George W. Bush. They're in the same collection as Monet, original Monets. What's the point? The man who we now know gives lavish gifts to one of our Supreme Court justices every year. If you visit his house, these are the people he has decided to put in the garden, so when you walk around, you see and you venerate.
Yep.
It's one thing to have a museum. Museums teach us about history and culture. It's another thing to have memorials.
Yep.
Memorials are for veneration. Memorials are for adulation. And that's what this is. In many ways, to me, it's no surprise that the group who believed and still believes it has an inherent right to power over the nation sees democracy as collateral damage in their culture war. If the will of the people needs to be left behind in order to make America, to remake America as the city on a hill, then so be it. The goal is to retake the country for God and for themselves, even if the republic has to be martyred in the process. Here we see the gallows that were erected for Mike Pence during the January 6th insurrection. As many scholars and journalists, including some of those here, have noted, the inscriptions on that set of gallows had religious connotations. In God we trust, amen, and so on, and so on, and so on. When I think of January 6th, I think of everything I've talked about today. It was a religious ritual carried out by the Americans who believe that they have a God-given right to rule the country. For them, a siege of the most important space in the United States government was a crusade against the enemies of the USA. The framework that guided them was Christian nationalism. But this is where I want to come back to story. They were characters living out a story.
Yep.
They were playing a role in a narrative that they think has cosmic significance. And I'm not going to lie to you, as somebody who lived this, who was a minister in this, who left it 15 years ago, stories are really, really powerful. Stories give a lot of people their place in the world.
Yep.
And when you give someone a role to play, oftentimes it means a lot to them. Even if somehow it means they end up on a plane flying to DC to try to overthrow a free and fair election at some point.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to talk, as we close here, about the stories we tell. I know this story because I converted into it when I was 14. When I became a believer, I became somebody who found community and answers to life's existential questions. And on a weekend like this, I would have proclaimed my belief in the resurrection of a Savior who would save us all. As believers, I was taught we were the ones who would not only proclaim the good news of salvation in the world, but we would save the nation from sure ruin. As believers, we were going to be the real Americans, the patriots, the stalwarts who would stand for the country's values by standing for God's commandments. On the flip side, we were told that those who didn't believe not only refused to see God's truth and God's reality, but could never be trusted. They could never be trusted to uphold the values of the American Republic.
Yep.
That to not believe in the sky God was a refusal to believe in America as a great experiment of freedom, democracy, and human flourishing. Atheists, I was told, were enemies of both the divine and of the nation. Now, I left that life 15 years ago, and I discovered many things. The certainty I was promised as an evangelical gave way to a wondrous complexity. And I think for many of you in the room, that's a lot of the reason why you continue to show up in places like this. To be around people for whom critical thinking, endless inquiry, discovery are some of your highest values.
Yes.
I came to an understanding of my condition as a human and my living with and by and for others as one filled with nuance, messiness, beauty, discovery, tragedy, and hope. The death of my evangelical God opened a horizon of intellectual discovery and community like I'd never experienced in the church. Coming to something like this convention only reaffirms that. Getting to talk to so many of you, hear your stories, hear how you're organizing, hear how you're fighting and resisting, break bread, have a laugh. It reaffirms the beauty of that complexity, even as it affirms the vulnerability of that condition, the fragility of all of it. But I also discovered something else. I discovered a different story about this country. I discovered a story about saving a republic that is as fragile as the relationships I just talked about. About building a union, a more perfect union, in ways that I never expected when I was religious. When I realized that those who were supposed to be the true Americans were the ones willing to turn their back on democracy in order to gain power. That it was patriotism in the guise of Christian nationalism, in the guise of the will to power and denomination. And what I know now is that those who have been told for centuries that they are not real citizens, not true members of the American body politic, are those who are going to play the central role in rescuing this country from authoritarian ruin and leading us toward the more perfect union we've heard about so many times. What I've discovered is a story about proud and courageous coalitions of non-believers. I've learned a story that I, and I think many of us, can participate in. A narrative. So here's the story I embrace now. That we are real Americans because we are the believers in what? The flourishing of all people, in the pursuit of life for all people, liberty for all people, justice for all people, and happiness, and dare I say, flourishing for all people. Those whose resistance to Christian hegemony is an affirmation of my adherence and my embodiment and my hope for society that lives up to its promises, that doesn't give up on the experiment of those values. As I listened to so many of the great speakers from yesterday, as I listened to folks this morning talk about local elections, what it takes to organize, what it means to be on a board when you're outnumbered, and when the political machinery is just churning and churning and churning. What I learned is something that I've accepted as I've done my work over the last decade, and that's this. Politics is not a zero-sum game, because it's just not some game. This is the game. What's the point of standing together, arguing for rights, representation, legitimacy, and a collective voice as atheists, if not to fight for every human being's flourishing? What is the point of our human condition if not to contribute, to build, to imagine a society in which such flourishing is possible for all of us? Regardless, as I think we all agree on, of creed, color, gender identity, sexual identity, and so on. For me, when we live out this story, when you play any role in this quest, there is no losing. There is no defeat. There may be setbacks. There may be tough days. There may be crushing results. There may be moments of, I'm not sure I can do this anymore. COVID wrecked what we had going. Our momentum is not there anymore. Some of the faces that I counted on aren't there. Another election, closer, but no cigar. And I guess my response, and this is at least what I live by, is that every time you try to live the story, as an organizer of a local chapter, as showing up at a protest for reproductive rights, recruiting new folks to recall a corrupt leader, every time you dare run for office, speak up at a school board meeting, pass out a pamphlet, there is no losing. There's an inch by inch, step by step march toward the world we all know isn't fantasy, isn't from a sky god who will come down to save us, but a world that is possible. A society that is possible. So when I talk about story, I'm not talking about myth or fantasy. I'm talking about a chain of memory. The idea that those who come behind us are going to need a role to play and values to live out. They'll need elders to look up to and fights to remember. Anticipation that they will do the same for those who come after them. That's what we give our kids. That's what we hope they'll give ours. And that's how we win. Thanks. There's it. 10 minutes. All right. This says 9 minutes, but you said 10, so we're going to go 10. So I think that means we get to have a question or two. Is that right? Okay, so if you have a question or two, I think someone's going to have a mic, and I see two folks right up here in the center.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, the clip that you played at the beginning of the lady that was running for office, professing to be Christian nationalists, and then Putin and all that, how do they, how can they use those words, a Christian nationalist, and consider themselves Christians, and then, Jesus always talked about in the Bible, you're supposed to love your enemies, do good to them that persecute you, blah, 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 invite the stranger in. Where do you think they get that from?
Yeah.
And then equate Christianity into what they're doing, like their call to violence.
Yeah, great question. Thank you. So there's a passage in the book of Matthew, chapter 28, that says, "Go into all the nations and make disciples." And many of you have been on the wrong end of that chapter. What they would say is, when Jesus says, "Go make disciples of all nations," he doesn't mean go into all the nations and try to convert your neighbor and your friend and your person at work and whoever else. What he means is disciple the nations, meaning make the nation into a Christian one. So every nation, whether it's Russia or the United States or it doesn't matter, should be a Christian one. And so the Christian's role is not, like many of us might think, somebody comes up down your street and says, "Hey, have you met the Lord and Savior," right? The role is actually to get in every dimension of the nation's body, right? School board elections, mayor elections, comptroller, county supervisor, right? Billionaire, economic leader, and to disciple the nation that way. And thus every nation should take care of itself, because the Christians in that nation will disciple that nation themselves. And so you can justify the nationalism based on that idea of Christianity. To your second question, Stephen Wolfe, in that book I mentioned, The Case for Being a Christian Nationalist, he cites a lot of famous theologians, Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine and these kind of folks, John Calvin, in order to justify a position that goes like this. When Jesus says love your neighbor, he means to love those who are like you more.
Yeah.
And I'm not making that up.
No,
Don't go check the book. I'll send you my notes if you don't pay. Don't pay for the book, please don't, okay? So he says, you should love those who are like you most. That's what God wants. So and he says this, a white European male born in the United States should love those people more. Doesn't mean he should not love others, but his responsibility in his mind is really to those people. And everyone else, they might need to suffer at the hand of that kind of hierarchical understanding of love. And so that's how they would justify their Christianity. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. My name is Paul Pearson, Houston, Texas, and I come out as an atheist every damn day of my life. Thank you. So that book right now on Amazon is number 43 in Church State Religious Studies, 34 in History of Religion and Politics, and number 19 in Nationalism. That's how terrifying this is.
It is, and again, once again, in that book, I wrote a whole article about this. Please don't buy the book. I will send you the article. Please don't. Okay. He uses the words Volk and homeland a lot.
No,
Volk, V-O-L-K, and homeland are words he actually uses to describe his nationalism. He just finished a postdoc at Princeton. So, again, you might think this is a manifesto self-published, right? From somebody in the basement. It's not. This is somebody who, as we just heard, continues to sell books and be incredibly influential.
Yep.
Right.
Okay, so I have a slightly vested interest in this one, as you know. Can you tell us a little bit about the white flight from California to the American Redoubt in northern Idaho?
Yes, would love to, thank you. So one of the things that is happening is that there is a white Christian nationalist migration to what many people call the American Redoubt. The American Redoubt is the region of the country that is Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, plus the eastern parts of Washington and Oregon on that side of the Cascade Mountains.
Yeah.
And about a decade ago, survivalists dubbed it the American Redoubt because he said, and redoubt means like refuge or safe space. People want to make fun of you about safe spaces, just listen up here. They dubbed that the American Redoubt because they dubbed it the last place where they could build a Christian separatist society and prepare for the end and collapse of the United States as we know it. Get ready for the next Civil War. Now you might think, again, right, fringe movement. Well, the writer of that manifesto, his name is James Wesley Rawls, got about 300,000 folks who visit his website weekly. He's written 5 books, a couple of bestsellers. He's an incredibly influential figure. The folks who are undertaking that migration are not few in number. There's enough of them that there are now redoubt realtors, meaning that there are realtors who make their living by helping folks from Sacramento and Anaheim and Phoenix and everywhere else find acres of land to buy in northern Idaho or Montana so they can set up their little homestead in a Christian separatist society. Now, there are also a lot of folks moving to Idaho because they think of it as a place that's affordable, a place that is, and it is, this is an objective fact, an overwhelmingly beautiful part of the country. And so in 2018 alone, you had 80,000 Californians move to Idaho. Boise's one of, if not the fastest growing metro area west of the Mississippi. It'll surpass San Francisco soon in population. If you try to buy a house in Boise at the moment, good luck. It's expensive and there's not a lot available. My argument would be this, and I'm happy to give this talk somewhere else for another hour because that's really what we need. My argument would be this: I come from Southern California, where I grew up. I have about 100 people I could gather right now who have moved to Idaho that I know, people from church and high school. And if I ask those folks, hey, are you moving there for the American Redoubt? They look at me like, what, you crazy professor, you liberal. No, I like lakes. I just want my kids to grow up in a place that they're not on the 5 freeway all the time, and I don't want Governor Newsom telling me about guns, and I don't want to wear a mask. You want people jabbing your kids with the vaccine? I don't think so. That's why we're going to Idaho. And I usually say, well, why don't you all go to Memphis? I used to live in Memphis. It's pretty affordable. There's a nice river. It's called the Mississippi River. It goes right through there, How about Albuquerque? Well, no, I don't think so, right? And what it comes down to is Idaho's 93% white.
Yep.
So I don't think all of those folks are moving there saying to themselves, I want to be a Christian extremist preparing for civil war. But when I tell them that that's where a lot of folks are moving to because that's what they want, it's not a deal breaker. But the school system in Memphis and the brown folks in Albuquerque kind of is. So they're telling on themselves, even if they won't admit that it's Christian extremism or separatism or anything else, right? So that's a whole other talk. There's a whole chapter in the book about that. So, it's really just delightful and uplifting reading, if you get it. I'm way more fun at parties than this sounds, I promise. So, all right, we have 40 seconds. Is it time to go? We gotta go. All right, thank you very much.